Is it time to talk about the meaning of life? I think it's getting deep.
The other part of your book, right? The other part of your book.
No, go on.
What is the meaning of life, Philip?
Yeah. So, but most of this book is just a sort of cold-blooded scientific and philosophical argument for cosmic purpose, arguing that there is reason to take seriously this idea of goal-directedness at the fundamental level of reality. Weird as it sounds, I just think that's where the evidence is pointing to, and we have to face up to that. I annoy people on Twitter by suggesting that Bertrand Russell would have believed in cosmic purpose because he followed the evidence where it led, but it just wasn't there when he was alive. But so yeah, most of the argument is that just cold-blooded case for that. But I suppose in the first and last chapters, I'm thinking about the implications for human existence. And yeah, I don't want to be kind of too dogmatic about what is the single way of living a meaningful life. I suppose I'm interested in suggesting options that are maybe different from the familiar options of traditional religion on the one hand and secular atheism on the other. But yeah, overall, I think there's a defend a kind of middle way ground here, really. On the one hand, you get some religious philosophers like William Lane Craig who say, if there's no point to the universe, it's all pointless. We might as well just rape and kill each other. It's all totally pointless and meaningless. The other extreme, you get, the familiar secular atheist position that probably there isn't cosmic purpose, but if there is, it's totally irrelevant. We make our own meaning, whatever. So I try to defend a middle way that, yeah, you can have perfectly meaningful life without being a purpose to the universe, by pursuing kindness and creativity and knowledge and so on. But if there is a purpose to the whole of reality, then maybe there's a potential for our lives to be more meaningful. If you can contribute in some small way to the purposes of the whole of reality, that's huge. we want our lives to make a difference. That's about as big a difference as you could imagine making. So yeah, and just finally, I suppose, just speaking for myself, I feel starting to live as a cosmic purposivist, this living in hope that there's a greater purpose to what's going on here.
A cosmic what?
Purposivist. Cosmic purposivist. Right?
I see.
Living in hope of a greater purpose to what's going on. I have found to be a deeply kind of meaningful form of living. I think most of all, it has brought me a deep sense of peace in some way. I was talking to my wife about this just this week. Because I guess I'm quite kind of career driven. I hope partly through pure motives, like I really believe in the things I'm arguing for and I want to persuade the world. Probably there's a bit of ego there as well, want to kind of make my mark or whatever. But I found that cosmic purposivism has made me less bothered about those things. Not because I don't think they're important, but because I'm conceiving of them as part of some much bigger thing that's going on that I'm inevitably just a tiny part of. And hence my task is just, to do the best I can to contribute to this much bigger thing going on. And conceiving of things in that way, I suppose, makes me less bothered about my own personal successes and failures and frees me up to enjoy life a little bit more, enjoy playing in the snow as I was with my family this weekend. Not that I wasn't happy before, but maybe brought a deeper sense of happiness. So yeah, so I suppose I'm just trying to suggest options that aren't the familiar options for thinking about the meaning of life.
Okay. How do you argue that, by the way? So you just outlined some views, but how do you argue that those views are correct?
Well, that's I guess going back to the starting point. So part of it is the fine-tuning of physics for life, which I think just in our standard Bayesian way of thinking about things just is evidence that there is some kind of goal-directedness towards life in the very early stages of the universe. And I think we're sort of in denial about that because it just doesn't fit with how we've got used to thinking about science. As I said, there's, I used to think the multiverse option was the obviously more plausible option for a long time. Cosmic purpose sounded very silly to me, but I've been persuaded that there's some dodgy reasoning going on in trying to explain fine-tuning in terms of the multiverse. I could talk about that if you want. Yeah. And, also the kind of arguments about making sense of the evolution of consciousness that we started talking about then. So it's those two things, I think, making sense of the emergence of conscious understanding, which I think belies our current scientific paradigm, and the fine-tuning of physics for life. Most people think, oh, well, God is the alternative, but I think there's a middle ground, a neglected middle ground here between the traditional atheist picture of a meaningless, purposeless universe and the traditional Western God, on the other hand.
Don, what is the meaning of life to you? And feel free to comment on anything that Philip has just said.
Well, first, on the point of agreement, I think that I believe in a version of purpose, of conscious purposiveness, whatever the word was. So I think it's not the standard physicalist framework that we're nature red in tooth and claw, and there's really no meaning of purpose, and it's pointless. I think that's just taking the headset literally when we shouldn't take the headset literally as the final word. My own view on purpose is, and comes with who I think we are. So I don't think I'm a 160-pound object in space-time. I think that space-time is a tiny data structure inside me and inside you. I think that I am and you are consciousness that transcends any scientific theory. That I am the deep reality and you are the deep reality of consciousness. You are that consciousness. And in fact, there's only one. So in fact, my view is that right now, consciousness in a Hoffman avatar, a Philip Goff avatar, and a Curt avatar is talking to itself, the one infinite consciousness. And what it's doing is finding out about itself. In some sense, the infinite consciousness knows itself by knowing what it's not. It plunges itself into this little headset, loses itself, thinks it's a little object in space-time, and then slowly wakes up and realizes, no, I transcend this headset. And that's how it knows what it is, by knowing with countless headsets what it's not. So the purpose is, from my point of view, is consciousness is here to know itself by waking up to what it's not. And the fundamental thing that comes out of this is that, some religions say love your neighbor as yourself, but I'm saying your neighbor is yourself. And that is the foundation for true love, is to recognize that that's just me under a different avatar. Even my cat is me under a different avatar. And so from this point of view, the whole purpose of life is I'm this infinite consciousness that is finding out who I am. And it's a theorem that it'll never be done. It's a mathematical theorem that no system can ever truly know itself, because in the very act of knowing yourself, you build a model of yourself and you become more complicated. So now you have to get a new model of yourself with the more complicated model and so forth. So this is the one consciousness, the infinite consciousness, posing as a philosopher, as a scientist, and as a podcast interviewer, and learning about itself and waking up. And eventually it takes off this headset and tries on a less cheap headset than this one, and goes through the same process in a different way. So that's sort of my guess about what it is. And what
can I just add something to that? I mean, I guess it's another point in which I value Don's work and in which we're trying to do something similar, that I think there's a huge demographic, a huge proportion of the population that identify as spiritual but not religious. But in general, academics don't cater for that for that group. You know, in academic philosophy, you know, I would say most people are secular atheists. There's some really good quality philosophy of religion, but it tends to be very traditional Christians,
Right.
few Jews. There's one very good Muslim philosopher of religion that's in the analytic tradition that's emerged recently. And then I think from that, we get this perception that spiritual but not religious is fluffy thinking and not very thought through. But I think that's just the contingent circumstances that, you know, academics haven't put rigorous work into developing philosophically, scientifically supported options here. So this is one thing I'm trying to do with this book. And I've got a 3-year Templeton project on trying to work out if the universe is conscious. That's kind of related to this stuff that funded this conference that Don came to, where I debated Sean Carroll on whether consciousness is fundamental. People can check out on YouTube if they're interested in. But yeah, so I think that's very exciting that this whole new, I mean, it's always been there to an extent, but is connecting up this whole new kind of academic area of trying to make rigorous sense of between traditional religion and secular atheism, and just, you know, expanding the debate is always really interesting and adds new challenges. Although I don't like this idea that we're all the same person. I guess I'm a little bit more Western in my thinking than Eastern on this regard. I sort of feel like the value of love and self-sacrifice, right, is that you're not me and I'm still, you know, sacrificing myself for someone that's not me, that's the other. And I find that's what's beautiful about love. And when it's like, oh no, it's just me, it's all me, that kind of depresses me.
Then it's masturbation.
Yeah, sex is just masturbation. I hadn't thought of it. That makes it even worse now you put it that way. But I mean, that's not an argument. That's just a sort of primal ethical response.
Many of these claims come down to gut intuitions. So, Don, I'm curious about the neurons not existing, but the cat existing. So the cat is an avatar that has its own perspective. Then if we were to scale that down into the perspective of a neuron, then does a neuron still technically exist if you're not there because the neuron has its own headset? Or even, let's just say the cat.
Well, yeah, or the cat, right. So ultimately, it's consciousness looking at itself through a headset. And so sometimes it sees itself. So what does a headset do? The headset dumbs things down, right? That's what a headset does. It deletes lots of information. So from this point of view, I should be very, very clear. The distinction that we make between living and non-living things is not principled. And the distinction between conscious and unconscious objects is not a principled distinction. In my point of view. So right now I'm looking at you guys on a video screen, and I see pixels of Curt's face and Philip's face and so forth. But I also see pixels of the background, like of the walls and so forth. Now, some of the pixels are giving me insight about Philip's and Curt's consciousness, and others are giving me nothing on the wall. Now, do I want to say that certain pixels, like, are conscious? These are the conscious pixels, and those are the unconscious pixels? No, that's dumb. Pixels are just pixels. From this point of view in which space-time is just a headset, the distinction we make between living things like cats and non-living things like rocks is entirely an artifact of the limits of our headset. I'm always interacting with consciousness, always. And I'm always interacting with an equally complicated one infinite consciousness. I'm always interacting with that. So there's not like stupid consciousnesses. No, I'm always interacting with the one infinite consciousness. But my interface, because it's an interface, dumbs things down. So when I'm interacting with the cat, I am this one consciousness interacting with itself through a headset and looking at itself. So I'm getting a cat image of myself or a bacterium image of myself, or whatever it might be. These are all perspectives of myself. They're just perspectives. They're not the truth, but I'm always interacting with the one infinite consciousness. Now, in the paper that we're about to write on this, we actually have an idea about how to talk about the one, right? We found a partial order on consciousnesses. So it's a mathematical structure. It's a non-Boolean order on consciousnesses. It's a completely mathematically rigorous thing. And so it turns out it's non-Boolean, and there's no ultimate top to the one. So when I talk about the one, I'm not talking, typically we think there's some guy at the top or something like that. No, this is, the mathematics of this is far more complicated. It's a completely non-Boolean structure. And so when I talk about the one, I haven't wrapped my head around conceptually what that could possibly be. It's too complicated. Also, to wrap your head around it, you'd have to go all the way up Cantor's hierarchy and beyond Cantor's hierarchy. So this is a partial order that goes all the way up Cantor's hierarchy and so forth. So when I talk about the one, it's not a trivial thing. There's the mathematics is complicated, and I'm sure this complicated mathematics is trivial compared to the structure of the one. So whatever this one is, it's truly impressive, and it's looking at itself through cats and rocks and so forth. But I'll just repeat again: the distinction between living and non-living is not principled. There's no deep distinction there, and the distinction between conscious and unconscious is not principled. All of them are artifacts of the limitations of our headset, and nothing deeper than that.
If you enjoyed this toe clipping, then the full video is linked in the description. You should also sign up for Toe Mail, which is again in the description and the pinned comment. You'll receive immediate access to all exclusive updates from the Theories of Everything podcast. It also helps me communicate directly with the core toe community. You'll also receive my top 10 toes. Think of it as the intellectual version of Quentin Tarantino's Obsession.